Hello, today we're going to read chapter 17, Jim Crow. What a fool. Jim Crow wasn't real. He was the name of a character in a song about a black man who sang and danced and never gave anyone any trouble. Wheel about, turn about, dance just so. Every time I wheel about, I shout Jim Crow. The Jim Crow character was well known on the stages of the North. Later, offstage, his name came to stand for an evil policy, the policy of separation of races, also known as segregation. Before the Civil War, the North had something the South didn't have. It had segregation. In the North, the races were separated not by law, but by habit. Usually blacks and Indians and Asians were not welcome in white hotels, restaurants, schools, or theaters. They could not get good jobs. The name for that policy of segregation became Jim Crow. Jim, that old fool dancer, sang and danced and acted as if he was content with things as they were, but he was crying on the inside. In the antebellum South, there was slavery but no segregation. Whites were the masters, but whites and blacks often lived and worked together. This is a little tricky, but be sure you understand this. It In the South, blacks and whites often had close ties. Although it may seem strange to us now, some slaves and slave owners liked each other. No 40 acres and no mule. The former slaves expected to be given free land with their freedom. There was a rumor, and it was wildly believed, that they would each get 40 acres and a mule. After all, African Americans had worked for nothing for generations. Thaddeus Stevens and the radical Republicans tried to see that black people got land, but it didn't happen. Blacks got freedom and poverty. After the Civil War, things stayed much the same in the North. Segregation by habit continued. In the South, nothing was the same. Remember, Reconstruction was a time of confusion, change, and experiment. Here's a quick review of what happened to the newly freed men and women during Reconstruction. At first, the Southern states passed terrible black codes that practically made black people slaves again. Then Congress sent army troops south. Some Northern abolitionists went with them. Years of congressional reconstruction followed. Many blacks got a chance to go to school, to vote, and to hold public office. Some white Southerners didn't seem to want a fair interracial society. Some did. Most were confused. For blacks, Reconstruction began as a time of hope, but conditions were terrible in the South. The war had left almost everyone poor. In 1877, when the Army troops left, Congressional Reconstruction was finished. The South was on its own. White Southerners turned to backward looking leaders. Those leaders blamed blacks and Northern carpetbaggers for all the trouble in the South. The Redeemers, those who wanted to end Reconstruction, began by counting votes incorrectly. That's called voter fraud. They paid some poor blacks for their votes. Eventually, they took the franchise, the vote, from the blacks and the poor whites by passing poll taxes and other laws that meant to keep blacks from voting. Without the vote, blacks were powerless. Jim Crow began dancing around the Southern land. Lawmakers passed laws that made it a crime for the races to be together. Soon blacks and whites had to ride in separate railroad cars, go to separate schools, eat in separate eating places, pray in separate churches, and get buried in separate cemeteries. There was nothing blacks could do about it. Remember, they're no longer able to give the right to vote. They're no longer able to vote. The poll tax, later found to be unconstitutional, meant you had to pay a tax to vote. Other laws made people pass a written test in order to vote. Sometimes different tests were given to blacks and whites. The words equal justice under law are carved on the United States Supreme Court building, but during Reconstruction, the Supreme Court upheld certain Jim Crow laws that denied equal justice to African Americans. By the time a new century arrived, black citizens who had high hopes after the Civil War were now sometimes worse off than before. Hundreds of blacks were lynched, hanged by white mobs, and police did nothing about it. The 14th Amendment says, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person with its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law." And the 15th Amendment says, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." Were the Jim Crow laws constitutional or unconstitutional? What do you think? Were the Southern states defying the Constitution when they passed laws to treat blacks and whites differently? Of course they were. In 1896, some Louisiana citizens went to the Supreme Court to see what they could do about it. 6 years earlier, the Louisiana General Assembly had passed a bill that said railroad companies must provide separate but equal accommodations for white and colored races on passenger trains. Homer Plessy's great-grandfather was African. Everyone else in his family had European background. Plessy's skin was white, but according to the racists, anyone with any African blood at all was black, so Homer Plessy was considered a black. His friends in New Orleans wanted to show the ridiculousness of the whole idea of racial categories. That's why they chose white-skinned Homer Plessy for a test case. They got Plessy to sit in the white section of a railroad car. When the conductor was told that he was black, Plessy was arrested and charged with breaking the law and put in jail. Plessy and his attorney said that the separate but equal law was unconstitutional. New Orleans Judge John H. Ferguson said they were wrong. Plessy's case made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. The case of Plessy versus Ferguson is famous for becoming one of the worst decisions the Supreme Court ever made. It changed the lives of millions of people, and not for the better. The court agreed with Judge Ferguson. After that, Jim Crow went wild. He danced and sang like fury. Separate but equal became the way of the South. Before the Plessy case, there were many examples of integration in the Southern states. 20 years later, there were almost none. One Supreme Court Justice, John Marshall Harlan, disagreed with the other justices. He said so in strong language. He wrote a dissenting opinion in Plessy versus Ferguson. Justice Harlan said, "In the view of the Constitution, in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior, dominant ruling class of citizens. Our Constitution is colorblind, and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens." Justice Harlan's words are worth remembering. Every lawyer knows them. Every American should. It would take time, but finally the Supreme Court agreed with Harlan. Separate is not equal. In 1954, the Supreme Court changed its mind. Plessy versus Ferguson was reversed. Segregation was found to be unconstitutional, and Jim Crow was kicked off the stage. Frederick, Frederick Douglass, speaking at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893, said, "Men talk of the Negro problem. There is no Negro problem. The problem is whether American people have loyalty enough, honor enough, patriotism enough, to live up to their own constitution. We Negroes love our country. We fought for it. We ask that we be treated as well as those who fought against it.